Satire has a long and venerable history, but in many ways the 18th century is its golden age for a couple of reasons. One, this is the real dawning of the printing press, so widely spread, widely dispersed satire is possible. Another is, I suppose, the growing number of things that are up for satirization or which can be satirized. And you also have, in this age, some of the most eminent writers. Voltaire in France developed satire as an art form, satirizing church and state, which leads to his imprisonment and exile. And in Great Britain, Jonathan Swift, clergyman, one of the greatest writers in the English language. And Swift said that satire is a glass in which we see everyone's faces but our own. His Tale of the Tub is one of the great works in the English language, as is Gulliver's Travels, the novel. And Voltaire read Gulliver when it was first published in England in 1726. Voltaire then was in exile in England and very much wanted a French translation of this masterpiece. Robert Walpole, who becomes the first Prime Minister of England, never forgave Swift for the characterization of Lord Flimnap, who was one of the political leaders among the Lilliputians. He saw this as a not too thinly veiled attack on him. And remember, Swift was a clergyman. His real ambition was to become a bishop, and the Prime Minister appoints bishops and also oversees the plum clerical assignments, and so Swift, through his pen, ensured he would never rise in the church hierarchy. Now, this is a golden age, so we have authors like Voltaire. Voltaire himself is a pseudonym, and Swift writing under pseudonyms because it was against the law to name someone or attack someone in print, which is why you see in satirical works pseudonyms as well as blanks, Lord so-and-so, or certain words that won't be spelled out. But it becomes clear who is under attack here. In Gulliver, Gulliver attacks most of the sacred cows of the 18th century. The floating island of Laputa, which hovers over this continent, is the domain of mathematicians and philosophers, and the mathematicians, the speculative theorists who are running the island nation, have to be reminded if it's time for them to listen to something or say something, because people called flappers follow them, holding a little stick on the end of which is a sack filled with stones. And when the philosopher's attention is needed, flapper will whack him in the ear, and when the philosopher has to say something, will whack him in the mouth. Otherwise, they're lost in their speculative theories. And the Gulliver has to have a new suit made, and so one of their scientists is sent with a quadrant to measure him and gets a figure wrong. So he wears a very ill-fitting robe, but no one notices because everyone wears these ill-fitting robes. You have this society governed by the mathematical formulas of someone like Sir Isaac Newton. You also, of course, have the land of the Brobdingnags, the giants, and they find it hilarious that little Gulliver, now who's a tiny figure, in his first voyage he was huge among the Lilliputians, but now he's tiny, and the king of the Brobdingnags holds him up and laughing, "Are you a Whig or a Tory?" It's hilarious that these little people will have a whole society in which they're governed, and then it ends, of course, with Gulliver among the Houyhnhnms, the horses, who are actually the rational creatures, kind, rational, and unable to lie. They have no concept of someone not telling the truth, so they will say, "You have said that which is not something which is not so." And all in competition, not really, with the Houyhnhnms are the Yahoos, the humans. It's different worlds that Gulliver experiences, just as in Voltaire's Candide. Dr. Pangloss leads Candide through a variety of different places, but always intoning that this is the best of all possible worlds. And the ability to see the world differently. This is what happens in satire, to mock that which is so outrageous, that which is open to satire, using pseudonyms, creating this world that looks very much like our own. Now, Franklin created some memorable satires, beginning with the Silence Dogood letters, which he wrote as a teenager. Number 4 satirizes Harvard College. Silence Dogood, the middle-aged widow, drifts off to sleep after talking with her clergyman about where her son should go to school, and she dreams about this place where all of these young scholars are attending, and they leave as poor as... Okay, so some, I perceived, at the end of their time here, took to merchandising, others to traveling, some to one thing, some to another, and some to nothing. And many of them henceforth, for want of patrimony, lived as poor as church mice, being unable to dig, ashamed to beg, and to live by their wits was impossible. Franklin, of course, could not go to college, and here he encounters this world where those who do are unable to fit in, unable to do anything constructive. Franklin wrote this when he was 16, and then he concludes about the folly of parents who, blind to their children's dullness, insensible of the solidity of their skulls, because they think their purses can afford it, will needs send them to the temple of learning, where, for want of a suitable genius, they learn little more than how to carry themselves handsomely and enter a room genteelly, which might as well be acquired at a dancing school, and from whence they return, after abundance of trouble and charge, as great blockheads as ever, only more proud and conceited. Franklin sees the folly of doing this, or inflicting education on children for no reason other than the parents can afford it. And essay number 7 satirizes one of the real literary forms of New England, the elegy, the funeral elegy. And Silence Dogood takes apart an elegy to Mehitabel Cattell, who died, and a suitable elegy was written. Come, let us mourn, for we have lost a wife, a daughter, and a sister, who has lately taken flight, and greatly we have missed her. Mocking the threefold appellation, a wife, daughter, and a sister, but saying that the line in the celebrated Watts, Isaac Watts, the great writer of hymns, Gunston the just, the generous, and the young, is nothing comparable to it. The latter only mentions 3 qualifications of one person who is deceased, which therefore could raise grief and compassion but for one, whereas the former, our most excellent poet, gives his readers a sort of an idea of the death of 3 persons, a wife, a daughter, and a sister, which is 3 times as great a loss as the death of one, and consequently must raise 3 times as much grief and compassion in the reader. And then Silence has a recipe for a New England funeral elegy, advising you to use the words etete sue, which will beautify it accordingly. And for the subject of your elegy, take one of your neighbors who has lately departed this life, no great matter at what age the party died, but it will be best if he went away suddenly, being killed, drowned, or froze to death. Having chose the person, take all his virtues, excellencies, etc. If he have not enough, borrow some to make up a sufficient quantity. And then he advises on some double rhymes, such as power, flower, quiver, shiver, grieve us, leave us, tell you, excel you, expeditions, physicians, fatigue him, intrigue him, etc. And you must spread all upon the paper. If you can procure a scrap of Latin to put at the end, it will garnish it mightily. Then, having affixed your name at the bottom with a Maestus Composui, you will have an excellent elegy. Note, this recipe will serve when a female is the subject of your elegy, provided you borrow a greater quantity of virtues, excellencies, etc. I think we can draw a direct line from this satire to Mark Twain's Emmeline Grangerford, and she writes a poem about anything so long as it is sadful. The 16-year-old Franklin, in the guise of Silence Dogood, is mocking New England, is mocking the heart of New England culture, and also mocking death. Now, probably Franklin's best-known satire, most interesting in many ways, is the speech of Miss Polly Baker, written in about the late 1740s. Miss Polly Baker was brought before a court of judicature in Connecticut, where she was prosecuted the 5th time for having a bastard child, which influenced the speech influenced the court to dispense with her punishment and induced one of her judges to marry her the next day. And what follows then is just the speech of Polly Baker. I am a poor, unhappy woman who have no money to fee lawyers to plead for me, being hard put to get a tolerable living. I shall not trouble your honors with long speeches, for I have not the presumption to expect that you may by any means be prevailed on to deviate in your sentence from the law in my favor. All I humbly hope is that your honors would charitably move the governor's goodness on my behalf, that my fine may be remitted. This is the 5th time, gentlemen, I have been dragged before your courts on the same account. Twice I have paid heavy fines. Twice have been brought to public punishment for want of money to pay those fines. This may have been agreeable to the laws. I do not dispute it. But since laws are sometimes unreasonable in themselves and therefore repealed, and others bear too hard on the subject in particular circumstances, therefore there is left a power somewhere to dispense with the execution of them. And Polly Baker has lived a life inoffensive in the neighborhood where she was born. She defies her enemies, if she has any, to say if she ever wronged any man, woman, or child. Abstracted from the law, I cannot conceive, may it please your honors, what the nature of my offense is. I have brought 5 fine children into the world at the risk of my life. I've maintained them well by my own industry, without burdening the township. Could have done it better if it had not been for the heavy charges and fines I have paid. Can it be a crime to add to the number of the king's subjects in a new country that really wants people? I own I should think it rather praiseworthy than a punishable action. I have debauched no other woman's husband, nor enticed any innocent youth. I was never charged with these, nor has anyone the least cause of complaint against me, unless perhaps the minister or the justice, because I have children without being married, by which they've missed a wedding fee. But can even this be a fault of mine? I appeal to your honors. You are pleased to allow I don't want sense, but I must be stupid to the last degree, not to prefer the honorable state of wedlock to the condition I've lived in. She says she's still willing to enter into wedlock. The first man by whom she was seduced had promised to marry her. Hasn't been seen since, although now he is a magistrate in this very court. She said she was sorry not to see him here today. And she talks about the course the law will have, the punishments being exacted on her for doing what is God's will, to be fruitful and multiply, and says, what are the consequences of these laws? Reflect a little on the horrid consequences of this in particular. What numbers have procured abortions? How many distressed mothers have been driven by the terror of punishment and public shame to imbrue, contrary to nature, their own trembling hands in the blood of their helpless offspring? Nature would have induced them to nurse it up with a parent's fondness. 'Tis the law, therefore, 'tis the law itself that is guilty of all these barbarities and murders. Repeal it then, gentlemen. Let it be expunged forever from your books. And on the other hand, take into wise consideration the great and growing number of bachelors in the country, many of whom, from the mean fear of the expense of a family, have never sincerely and honorably courted a woman in their lives, and by their manner of living leave unproduced, which I think little better than murder, hundreds of their posterity to the 1000th generation. Is not theirs a greater offense against the public good than mine? Compel them then by a law either to marry or pay double the fine of fornication every year. What must poor young women do whom custom has forbid to solicit the men, and who cannot force themselves upon husbands, when the laws take no care to provide them any, and yet severely punish if they do their duty without them? Yes, gentlemen, I venture to call it a duty. 'Tis the duty of the first and great command of nature and of nature's God, increase and multiply, a duty from the steady performance of which nothing has ever been able to deter me. But for its sake I have hazarded the loss of public esteem, frequently incurred public disgrace and punishment, and therefore ought, in my humble opinion, instead of a whipping, have a statue erected to my memory. in 1780, when Franklin was in France, he and Silas Deane had a conversation with the Abbé Raynal, French philosophe, who had written a number of books, and one in 1770, the Histoire philosophique et politique of the Indies, as the history and philosophy, the philosophical and political history of the Indies. And in it he included the story of Polly Baker as an example of American prolificness. That is, a woman like Polly Baker having 5 children, how much more fruitful Americans were than in Europe and unconstrained. He thought Polly Baker was a real person. Silas Deane was from Connecticut, so the Abbé Raynal asked him if he was familiar with Polly Baker, if he knew what town she lived in, if he knew if the law she spoke of had been repealed. And Deane says it was always his understanding, now Polly Baker, the story had been printed some 30 years earlier, that this was a hoax. Raynal doesn't believe it could be a hoax. No, it just seems like a speech, and it seems so true. And the two of them discuss this for a few minutes, and finally Franklin intercedes. He knew it was a hoax because he had written it. My word, Raynal says, I am more pleased to have included your tales in my work than the truths of others. Franklin writes other things, other satires in this period throughout his life, and they become more and more directed toward policies of the British government. Sometimes they're policies of the Pennsylvania government, and sometimes they're just things that are in need of mocking. So in the 1740s, when the British government proposes, and actually does continue, sending felons to America, and says this will be a way of helping to regenerate people who have broken the law, Franklin writes a little essay for the Pennsylvania Gazette saying that you can't really have a trade without sending something in exchange, so he proposes sending rattlesnakes to Britain in exchange for the felons, saying that the salubrious climate of England will help the rattlesnakes to reform. The rattlesnake, he said, may be a mischievous creature, and is changing his nature with the climb as a mere supposition, not yet confirmed by sufficient facts. What then? Is not example more prevalent than precept? And may not the honest, rough British gentry, by a familiarity with these reptiles, learn to creep and to insinuate and to slaver and to wriggle into place, and perhaps to poison such as stand in their way, qualities of no small advantage to courtiers, and comparison of which improvement in public utility, what is a child now and then killed by their venomous bite, or even a favorite lapdog? In the 1750s and the 1760s, as the dispute between Britain and the American colonies grew more pronounced, there was real fear in Great Britain of American manufacturing outstripping the British, an attempt to restrain the American trade. And Franklin, now living in England, wrote a series of essays for the British press, letters to the British press. And in one, he praised the British travel writers who wrote about things they had never seen, and says that this is actually a good thing. Dear sir, do not let us suffer ourselves to be amused with groundless objections. The very tales of America, there was a fear that Americans were going to be producing more wool because of their healthier sheep, and Franklin acknowledges this. The very tails of the American sheep are so laden with wool that each has a car or wagon on 4 little wheels to support and keep it from trailing on the ground. Would Americans caulk their ships? Would they fill their beds? Would they even litter their horses with wool, if it was not both plenty and cheap? And what signifies dearness of labor, where an English shilling passes for 5 and 20? Their engaging 300 silk throwers here in 1 week for New York was treated as a fable, because, forsooth, they have no silk there to throw. Those who made this objection perhaps did not know that at that same time agents for the King of Spain were at Quebec contracting for 1,000 pieces of cannon to be made there for the fortifications of Mexico, with 25,000 axes for their industrious logwood cutters, and at New York engaging in annual supply of warm floor carpets for their West India houses. Other agents from the Emperor of China were at Boston in New England, treating about an exchange of raw silk for wool to be carried on in Chinese junks through the Straits of Magellan. And yet all this is as certainly true as the account, said to be from Quebec in the papers of last week, that the inhabitants of Canada are making preparations for a cod and whale fishery this summer in the Upper Lakes. Ignorant people may object that the Upper Lakes are fresh and that cod and whale are saltwater fish, but let them know, sir, that cod, like other fish, when attacked by their enemies, fly into any water where they think they can be safest, that whales, when they have a mind to eat cod, pursue them wherever they fly, and that the grand leap of the whale in the chase up the fall of Niagara is esteemed by all who have seen it as one of the finest spectacles in nature. Really, sir, the world has grown too incredulous. Pendulum-like, it is ever swinging from one extreme to another. Formerly, everything printed was believed because it was in print. Now, things seem to be disbelieved for just the same reason. Wise men wonder at the present growth of infidelity. The leap of the whale, in this we can really see the origins of an American tall tale, the exaggeration, the taking something to its illogical conclusion. In 1773, Franklin wrote two satires. This is at the time the British Parliament had passed the Tea Act. Parliament was doing other things to try to constrain the American colonies. And Franklin wrote two essays. One was called Rules by Which a Great Empire May be Turned into a Small One, and going step by step through the process the British Parliament had been in to alienate the colonies. And the other was an edict from the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, who is announcing that that Great Britain had originally been settled by people from Germany. And thus the king was asserting his rightful power over the British colonies, and would do so using some of the very laws the British Parliament had passed to govern the American colonies. We flatter ourselves, the king says in conclusion, that these our royal regulations and commands will be thought just and reasonable by our much favored colonists in England, the said regulations being copied from their own statutes of 10 and 11 William III, 5th year of George II, and 23rd year of George II, 4th year of George I, and so on. No statutes from the era of George III, relying on older statutes and from other equitable laws made by their parliaments, or from instructions given by their princes, or from resolutions of both houses entered into for the good government of their own colonies in Ireland and America. They would forbid the British from manufacturing with iron, because this would, of course, compete with German manufacturing. And whereas the art and mystery of making hats have arrived at great perfection in Prussia, and the making of hats by our remote subjects ought to be as much as possible restrained, and forasmuch as the islanders before mentioned, being in possession of wool, beaver, and other furs, have presumptuously conceived they had a right to make some advantage thereof by manufacturing the same into hats to the prejudice of our domestic manufacture, we do therefore hereby strictly command and ordain that no hats or belts whatsoever, dyed or undyed, finished or unfinished, shall be loaded or put upon any vessel, cart, carriage, or horse, to be transported or conveyed out of one country in the said island into another, from one county in the said island into another county, or to any other place whatsoever. Penalty of £500 sterling. Also clamping down on the manufacture of wool. Now Franklin wrote to his son a few weeks after this was printed, saying, I've lately written two pieces here for the Public Advertiser on American affairs, designed to expose the conduct of this country toward the colonies. In short, comprehensive and striking view, and a short, comprehensive and striking view. And in his own mind, he said he preferred the first, that is, rules by which a great empire may be turned into a small one, as a composition for the quantity and variety of the matter contained, kind of spirited ending of each paragraph, but I find others generally prefer the second. I am not suspected as the author except by one or two friends, and have heard the latter spoken of in the highest terms as the keenest and severest piece that has appeared here in a long time. Lord Mansfield, I hear, said of it, that it was a very able, very artful indeed, and would do mischief by giving here a bad impression of the measures of government, and in the colonies by encouraging them in their contumacy. Franklin preferred the first, but he found when he went to get copies to send to his son, he could not find a copy of the second. It had sold out at the printers. It was reprinted again by the Chronicle, but without the capitalization that he liked. He was a little startled, but then he talks about going to breakfast, and he was at breakfast when the post brought the day's papers. Mr. Whitehead was there too, who goes early through all the papers and tells the company what he finds remarkable. He had them in another room, and we were chatting in the breakfast parlor, when he came running into us, out of breath, with a paper in his hand. "Here," says he, "here's news for you. Here's the King of Prussia claiming a right to the kingdom." All stared, I as much as anybody, and he went on to read it. When he had read 2 or 3 paragraphs, a gentleman present said, "Damn his impudence! I dare say we shall hear by the next post he's upon the march with 100,000 men to back this." Whitehead, who was very shrewd, soon after began to smoke it, and looking in my face said, "I'll be hanged if this is not some of your American jokes upon us." The reading went on, and ended with an abundance of laughing, and a general verdict that it was a fair hit, and the piece was cut out of the paper and preserved in my lord's collection. This fair hit, this American joke on the English that Franklin is using, mocking them, mocking British policy by saying, would the King of Prussia claim the same right to govern England by virtue of the fact that Germans had initially settled the British Isles? The parody that probably is not Franklin's was on the sale of the Hessians. It was dated Rome, 1777, and here the Germans are. Well, we'll skip this. Now, when Franklin was in France in 1781, the Royal Academy of Brussels published a prize question. That is, they were soliciting entries into a competition on natural philosophy, and they wanted to know what would be a proper subject, something of public utility that would be a useful thing for scientists to inquire into. Permit me then humbly to propose one of that sort for your consideration, and through you, if you approve it, for the serious inquiry of learned physicians, chemists, etc., of this enlightened age. It is universally well known that in digesting our common food, there is created or produced in the bowels of human creatures a great quantity of wind, that the permitting this air to escape and mix with the atmosphere is usually offensive to the company from the fetid smell that accompanies it, that all well-bred people, therefore, to avoid giving offense, forcibly restrain the efforts of nature to discharge that wind, that so retained, contrary to nature, it not only gives frequently great present pain, but occasions future diseases, such as habitual colics, ruptures, tympanies, etc., often destructive of the constitution and sometimes of life itself. Were it not for the odiously offensive smell accompanying such escapes, polite people would probably be under no more restraint in discharging such wind in company than they are in spitting or blowing their noses. My prize question, therefore, should be to discover some drug, wholesome and not disagreeable, to be mixed with our common food or sauces, that shall render the natural discharges of wind from our bodies not only inoffensive, but agreeable as perfumes. That this is not a chimerical project and altogether impossible may appear from these considerations, and he notes that different kinds of food do produce different smells, and that perhaps some lime water taken at dinner may have the same effect on the air produced in and issuing from our bowels. This is worth the experiment. Certainly, so why not do this? And why should it be thought more impossible to nature? Well, For the encouragement of this inquiry, for the immortal honor to be reasonably expected by the inventor, let it be considered of how small importance to mankind, or to how small part of mankind have been made useful, those discoveries in science that have heretofore made philosophers famous. Are there 20 men in Europe at this day the happier or even easier for any knowledge they have picked out of Aristotle? What comfort can the vortices of Descartes give to a man who has whirlwinds in his bowels? The knowledge of Newton's mutual attraction of the particles of matter, can it afford ease to him who is racked by their mutual repulsion and the cruel distensions it occasions? The pleasure arising to a few philosophers from seeing a few times in their life the threads of light untwisted and separated by the Newtonian prism into 7 colors, can it be compared with the ease and comfort every man living might feel 7 times a day by discharging the wind freely from his bowels, especially if it be converted into a perfume, for the pleasures of one sense being little inferior to those of another, instead of pleasing the sight, he might delight the smell of those about him, and make numbers happy, which to a benevolent mind must afford infinite satisfaction. The generous soul, who now endeavors to find out whether the friends he entertains like best claret or burgundy, champagne or Madeira, would then inquire also whether they chose musk or lily, rose or bergamot, and provide accordingly. And surely such a liberty of expressing one's sentiments and pleasing one another is of infinitely more importance to human happiness than that liberty of the press, or of abusing one another, which the English are so ready to fight and die for. In short, this invention, if completed, would be, as Bacon expresses it, bringing philosophy home to men's business and bosoms. So Franklin is mocking a lot of things here. He's mocking the academy, looking for something useful, and what could be more useful than this, and mocking science. What really difference has it made? The vortices of Descartes, what difference does this make to someone who has a whirlwind in his bowels? Mocking the Royal Academy of Nonsuch and mocking the scientific inquiry. Now, it was this kind of essay that later is going to get Franklin called into question for being a man of unsavory reputation. It also is going to be something that is going to put him on T-shirts in the 21st century, this kind of sentiment where the learned founding father, the learned scientist, can talk about farting. Whether he actually said fart proudly is a story for another day. Now, the final satire we'll mention is his last one, written in 1790, just a few weeks before he died. Franklin, as the leader, as the president of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery and the Slave Trade, had presented a petition to Congress to end the slave trade. And this drew forth from Congressman James Jackson of Georgia a blistering speech attacking the idea of emancipation, and also arguing that enslaving Africans was good not only for the economies of South Carolina and Georgia, but for the people of Africa themselves. Now, at this time, there are a couple of dozen Americans being held captive in Algiers, as Algiers made war on the United States and claimed the right of enslaving Christians. So this brings from Franklin his final published essay, Historic, under the name Historicus. He says he was reminded by reading Congressman Jackson's excellent speech of something he had written in Martin's account of his consulship in Algiers, published 100 years earlier. Of course, there is no such book. There is no Martin, who is a consul in Algiers, but it's the speech of Sidi Mohammed Ibrahim to the Divan of Algiers after a group of religious fanatics, the Erika, have called for ending the practice of piracy on Christians and the enslaving of Christians. And Sidi Muhammad asks, if we don't enslave the Christians, who will work for us? And aren't we doing them a favor by bringing them into this Islamic country where they can learn the one true faith? These are the same arguments Congressman Jackson had made. If we don't enslave the Africans, who will work for us? And aren't we doing them a favor by bringing them here to work? And Sidi Muhammad is arguing that enslaving Christians is actually a good thing. Good thing for them, a good thing for us. Our economy depends on their enslavement. And at the result of his speech, the divan decides that ending the enslavement of Christians would be problematic. This was the word that the proponents of slavery would use when all else failed. Yes, we may recognize slavery is immoral, but ending it would be problematic. And Franklin concludes by saying it's a melancholy show of proof of human understanding. It is a melancholy thing. Franklin, at the end of his life, is looking at the institution of slavery in America, and all he can do is satirize it, but satirizing it in a pointed way. Those who are proposing this show that he is not lecturing. The real virtue of satire is Congressman Jackson could read this. Swift had said that in satire we see everyone's face but our own. In Franklin's satires, in the pointed political ones like this one, in the New England Elegy, he really is making it impossible for us to miss who it is being satirized.